Welcome, everyone. Glad you could join us on this fine day. And on behalf of our team and board, I want to thank our CAN members, our corporate partners, and guests for joining us today for our mid-year check-in presentation, our 10th annual Force for Good Forecast report, which is one of the many ways where our team seeks to capture and share our thought leadership with the world. Next slide, please. As you know, Future 500 is a nonprofit consultancy whose mission is to build trust between corporations, advocates, investors, and philanthropists to advance business as a force for good. We've been at this work for 25 years, and we're experts now at enabling companies and their stakeholders to embrace the power of robust stakeholder engagement, which is really at the foundation of stakeholder capitalism, because it helps you anticipate and respond to material risks and opportunities so your companies can continually innovate, prosper, and thrive as a positive force in the world. One of the many ways we support corporate leaders like you is through our Corporate Affinity Network, aka CAN, which is an intimate peer network of executives who engage with each other and external thought leaders throughout the year on leading environmental, social, and governance issues that are material to your companies. Next slide, please. The agenda. We're going to be giving you a mid-year update on our forecast with ample time for your questions and to dive deeper into Q&A. Many of our CAN members are also planning to join our Q&A coffee hour tomorrow at 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern. Next slide, please. For the Q&A, we've got a great group of participants, and we truly welcome your questions and comments throughout the session so we can learn more from you and understand more deeply what's on top of all your minds so we can be helpful and responsive. So submit your questions by clicking Q&A, check the box if you prefer to be anonymous, and you can also share comments and feedback via the chat box. And if you need any help for any reason for tech challenges during the session, just send a private chat message to Future 500. Next slide, please. So what is the forecast? Well, a little background. Each fall, our team has a lot of fun arriving at our top trends. We hold a series of team brainstorming meetings, sometimes during happy hour, where we inventory kind of leading social, environmental, political, economic, and technology trends that we anticipate will shape engagement between corporations and their stakeholders in the coming year and beyond. We leverage our collective knowledge of funding strategies and trends, activist campaign plans, and emerging trends and issues, and have some terrific, vigorous debates on what should be in or out of our forecast. When one considers the past decade in which we've published these reports, we've gotten pretty accurate and get to observe fascinating evolutions of issues over the years as they become increasingly intersectional. So, for example, biodiversity is one trend in this year's report, but we can see the roots for this trend back in our 2012 and 2013 reports, where we highlighted growing concern for deforestation and safe and healthy food and water stewardship, which then grew into a larger networked campaigns focused on landscape level forest and agricultural restoration in 2016, and eventually to today, where we see a global push for science-based biodiversity targets, informing efforts to conserve 30% of the world's ecosystems by 2030 to sustain a livable planet, which we'll be diving into later. So the past informs our present and our future, and we hope that our 2021 report proves useful to all of you in your work. Next slide, please. So it's a real honor and a privilege to do our work building bridges between companies and their stakeholders, but it's a greater privilege to do it with an exceptional group of colleagues, several of whom you're going to hear from today. Next slide, please. So here are our top 9 trends from our 2021 forecast. Today, we're going to summarize what we predicted would happen this year, give some examples of the trend, and then briefly indicate how the trend may evolve in the future. So I'm now going to pass the virtual mic to Ellen to start us off on the first issue, which intersects with just about every other issue in our report.
Great. Thanks, Eric. We are starting off with a heavy topic right off the bat. And as Eric mentioned, this one really does touch on many of the other topics, if not all of them, included in our Force for Good this year because of its systemic and transformational nature. It has now been more than a year since the murder of George Floyd and a reckoning around systemic racism fueled by his death and the tragic deaths of so many others. And all kinds of organizations were truly taking a hard look in the mirror. On the right side of the screen, you will see a couple of examples of how stakeholders are seeking to establish whether companies, particularly those that issued statements in the wake of George Floyd's murder, are whether or not they're walking the talk on the racial justice issue, publishing racial justice and equity and workplace practice scorecards and trackers, seeking to monitor companies and really compare apples to apples. Just Capital's progress assessment finds that top employers are far more willing to disclose baseline diversity commitments than to take actions holding themselves accountable for progress. A recent Harris Poll survey done with Just Capital showed that 95% of Black Americans believe it's important for companies to promote racial equality, and 80% believe they can do more. Shareholders aren't letting go either, and companies should continue to expect pressure to grow and evolve their DEI and racial justice impact. The 2021 Proxy Preview report indicated that shareholders filed 69 proposals asking companies to disclose the diversity of their workforce and information on retention and promotions, twice the number filed last year, with an additional 30 filed on corporate board diversity, as well as a new campaign on 19 proposals asking companies and major banks to audit racism's effects on their business. But companies are not alone in grappling with these issues. NGOs and philanthropy also continue to face their own reckoning as record amounts of money pour into racial justice issues. The philanthropic community, particularly the mainstream, highly funded, and historically white environmental movement, is still grappling with directing power and funding to the communities most impacted by climate change and environmental degradation. And so as resources continue to shift into racial justice, all organizations should anticipate thinking and talking about environmental issues through the prism of the S or social issues. So for example, the issue of climate change isn't going anywhere. And it'll still be very top of mind for advocates, but they're looking to see companies talking about these issues with an understanding of the intersectionality of social pressures and a perspective of environmental justice. So if all of this sounds really messy and complicated and difficult, that's because it truly is. These are huge topics that we could spend hours talking about. And if you're interested in drilling down into specifics, we would just invite you to reach out to our team. But for a little breath of clarity in one of the most clean asks from advocates, I'm going to pass you off to Clara.
Clarity, good one, Ellen. Thank you. And as you probably already know, US-based companies with 100 plus employees are required to collect Equal Employment Opportunity, or EEO-1 data, on their employees' race, ethnicity, and gender. But they aren't currently required to share it publicly, at least not yet. And in this year's forecast, we noted that publishing EEO-1 data was one of the clearest and most actionable advocate asks. Investors were asking for it, shareholder advocates were demanding it, and firms were increasingly committing to release it. So where are we today? As of June 1st, 10 shareholder proposals asking companies to disclose EEO-1 data have gone to a shareholder vote. In April, IBM Corp's shareholders approved an annual DE&I report resolution by a whopping 94%. A proposal to report on EEO-1 data at Union Pacific received 86% support last month. For those that haven't voluntarily published their data, they may soon not have much of a choice. The SEC is considering more mandatory reporting, including potential workforce diversity disclosures. My colleague Andrea will elaborate on that shortly, but for EEO-1 data, here's the bottom line. Whether from investor or regulatory pressure, publishing your report or similar data will soon be the baseline expectation. Stakeholders are saying that releasing this data isn't optional. And since companies are already required to gather these metrics anyways, it's a lower lift for them. But some people worry that the numbers may be taken out of context. The EEO-1 report won't tell the full story on its own. So this is where additional commentary in a sustainability or a DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion report can add really helpful context. Companies not only need to start preparing to publish more data about their workforce, they also need to determine how they will authentically tell their diversity story and demonstrate a tangible strategy for how they will advance DEI progress. So speaking of ESG disclosures, let's hear from Andrea next.
Thanks, Clara. So we've watched the level of voluntary ESG disclosures grow exponentially over the last few years, and that's been driven by companies responding to investor demand for this information. So most people agree that climate risk is already financially material, but what's newer is that some investors and other stakeholders are arguing that other issues like human rights, by virtue of their intersectional nature, can't be separated from climate and will quickly reach that threshold for materiality as well. So under the Biden administration, the SEC has indicated that offering more guidance on this will be a central focus for the agency. And the newly appointed chair, Gary Gensler, suggested in his confirmation hearing that the subset of issues that could be considered material under previous guidance could actually be brought into things like human capital management, political spending, and workforce diversity, like Clara mentioned in the EO1 data, for example. So this is something that we predicted and highlighted in many of our previous forecasts, and now we're seeing it happen in real time. So in March, the SEC asked for public input on climate change disclosures, and they received overwhelming response from stakeholders. And these comments have been coming in as recently as yesterday. So this is probably one of the most contested issues in corporate governance and sustainability right now. I've had a chance to skim some of these responses, and it should probably come as no surprise to you that a lot of the commentary in favor focuses on the need for consistent and comparable information. So easier said than done, right? There's currently no standardized reporting framework, and many have pointed out that ESG issues that companies face can vary significantly based on the industry and the region. So while investors broadly support the use of frameworks like TCFD, the Task Force on Climate Disclosures, and SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, stakeholders recognize that there's no one magical, set of metrics. So one of the main criteria identified by Ceres and a coalition of other 500 other investors in their public comment is that industry-specific methods and regular updates to the guidance are really critical to reducing the reporting burden on companies. Many would like the SEC to designate, a third-party standard setter with broad institutional buy-in and expertise to help with this, but some have argued that this would have to be authorized by Congress. So it seems kind of unlikely to me that we would see anything finalized before 2022 or maybe even later. But bottom line, it's fairly clear that some kind of disclosure framework is coming. To what extent and whether it passes legal muster remains to be seen. But what this really means is that companies need to expand and refine their voluntary disclosures to keep up. So we have a poll now, and this is anonymous, so feel free to answer and without fear of being identified. But what I really want to stress is that if your company hasn't already done a materiality assessment or adopted SASB or TCFD frameworks, now is the time to start building that internal reporting infrastructure, getting cross-functional teams together, and just figuring out what data you should be collecting. We also recommend engaging with not only the SEC and standard setters, but also civil society orgs that you work with. Ask them for their opinions, what types of things they want to see from your reporting, because at the end of the day, the success of any kind of rule has to take into account the perspectives of companies that are doing the disclosing and the audience for the disclosures. We really do need buy-in from the corporate sector. And we have a lot of resources on this, including on materiality assessments, and different proposals to standardize metrics like ones from the World Economic Forum. I'll drop some of these things in the chat after this, but there's plenty more to unpack here. So please let us know what you're thinking about and whether you'd be interested in another webinar or more resources on this issue. So with that, I'm gonna go ahead and pass it off to Kellen.
Great, thanks, Andrea. I was just taking a look at these poll results as they're coming in, because we're about to transition over to a new pop quiz, since that's really what this is about, is seeing how savvy all of y'all are today. So to keep it going with the climate theme, would encourage Clara whenever you're ready to throw up that next poll, and we'll turn back to this in a minute. But in the interim, in recent years, we've highlighted in our trend reports stakeholders' growing focus on science-based targets as a corporate climate action best practice, securing new climate emission reduction commitments that are data-driven and are designed to comply with the Paris Agreement and 1.5 degree C warming scenarios. But over the past 12 months, a new type of climate target has entered the marketplace, and it's creating quite a buzz. And it's this concept of net zero. In 2020, corporate net zero climate targets more than tripled over 2019, and over 1/5 of the world's 2,000 largest companies now have a net zero target. But what does net zero mean anyway? To answer that, why don't we take a look at these results that are coming in here? Clara, would you mind going ahead and showing the results now? All right. Well, it looks like we've got a few savvy folks and a few snarky folks in the audience, maybe. The truth is, you are all correct. Everyone wins, or maybe everyone loses, according to most climate advocates. And that's because there is no standardized definition of a net zero climate target. And that is creating a lot of confusion and criticism and skepticism within the climate advocacy and climate science community. And you can kind of see that occurring over time as this timeline on the right side of the slide progresses here. So what are stakeholders' concerns? It's really threefold. First, what does that net in net zero mean? When are you starting your measurement and when are you ending it? Are you factoring in your company's entire historical emissions? Or are you using, for instance, a 1990 baseline? Similarly, how much of the value chain are you considering? Are you only thinking inside the fence line, scope 1 and 2 emissions, for instance, or are you thinking upstream to your suppliers, downstream to consumers, end of life? Are you using an emissions intensity target or an absolute emissions target? Similarly, how are you going to be reducing your emissions? The vast majority of current net zero commitments are either vague on the details, essentially saying, we're going to figure it out along the way, we've got some time, or they include a strong reliance on technologies and processes to remove carbon from the atmosphere outside of a company's value chain. So offsets, carbon capture and storage, or even direct air capture. And stakeholders have lots of criticisms of these approaches, arguing that they're unproven, unlikely to ever be commercially viable, or they rely on shaky market mechanisms that enable business as usual. And the final concern is, what's the glide path? Most companies are articulating net zero by 2050 targets, but they're not providing those interim checkpoints along the way. And climate experts emphasize that the vast majority of the reductions need to occur by 2030 if we're really going to bend the curve. And so stakeholders are concerned that these commitments are going to result in companies acting too little, too late. So what are companies to do? Well, if you're considering setting a net zero climate target, I would recommend just don't for now. Stick with science-based targets for now. They're more credible, calculable, and will force you to have the hard internal and external conversations about how to actually achieve your commitment in a way that's aligned with the science and stakeholder expectations. But if you or your starry-eyed CEO are really gung-ho on net zero and the brand attention that could conjure up, take heart. The Science-Based Target Network is currently developing the first global standard for net zero business. So we'd encourage you to engage with that network and other climate experts to ensure that whatever climate action you're taking, it's likely to be praised rather than ridiculed by stakeholders. With that, I'm going to hand it off to Ellen to talk about another trend that I would say is rapidly becoming as interesting and as prominent as climate. Ellen?
Thanks, Kellen. Great. Yes, this is a topic that has really been exciting me lately, as there's just so much going on. But quickly first, I'm going to doom and gloom you before I give you the good news. A 2020 report by Swiss Reinsurance found that 55% of global GDP depends on high-functioning biodiversity and ecosystem services, and that 20% of countries are at risk of ecosystem collapse due to a decline in biodiversity. Of the global biodiversity targets set in Japan in 2010, the world partially met 6 of 20 and fully met a whopping 0 of 20. And last fall, a survey by KPMG said that over 75% of the world's largest companies are not reporting risks from biodiversity loss. Stakeholders and especially investors are increasingly drawing links between biodiversity and climate change, as well as biodiversity and the public health crises like pandemics. In an ironic twist, perhaps, 2020 was really supposed to be the year of biodiversity. It's time to kind of shine as an issue, especially in a global context. But the COVID-19 pandemic pushed the UN Convention on Biological Diversity to 2021. So that'll now be taking place in China this October. The president of the UN General Assembly has said that the aim of CBD this year is to do for biodiversity what Paris did for climate change in 2015. And its big push is a cornerstone initiative for 30 by 30, which you heard Eric mention at the top of our presentation, to conserve 30% of the world's land and oceans by 2030. When our Force for Good forecast report came out, more than 50 countries had agreed to the proposal. And I think I saw yesterday that it was now around 80 countries. So definitely gaining traction. But let's come back to the investor pressure I mentioned, because there are huge calls for transparency and increased risk disclosure for companies. I'm sure many of you are familiar with some of the standard setting and reporting framework organizations that we've included on the right-hand side of the screen. But they're all here because they've announced new or updated guidance specifically on biodiversity slated for the next several years. So that's GRI, Science Based Targets Network, which governs science-based targets, CDP, and TNFD. So like the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, but for nature-related disclosure. GRI is likely to be first out of the gate. They've said their intended timeline is 2022, end of 2022. And there's a lot more we could say here, but I guess I will just leave it at, if your organization is thinking about how to engage with biodiversity issues throughout your value chain or how to report on the topic, now is really the time to engage. All of these frameworks include stakeholder feedback processes, whether through expert panels or public comment periods throughout their development. And there's just so much going on and so much really global attention that this issue is really only going to rise in the minds of stakeholders.
Hey, Ellen, just a quick question for you. You mentioned investor pressure and interest in disclosure on biodiversity. So can you comment at all on some of the pressures that investors themselves are facing on this topic?
Yeah, I think this is so interesting because really no one is escaping pressure here. And so this past March, the EU's 2019 Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, or SFDR, became effective, and it imposes broadly sustainability-related disclosure requirements on financial service institutions like banks, insurance companies, pension funds, investment firms. And the purpose of this is really to enable end investors to separate out greenwashing when we're thinking about, ESG investment. And biodiversity impacts make up a key category of the disclosure that will be required as part of this mandatory disclosure beginning in 2022. And so while, of course, this does pertain to the EU, as we know, EU regulation often has knock-on effects that we see in the US and elsewhere around the world. So I think this one, in terms of its ripple effects, it's really going to be an interesting one to watch. Thanks. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brendan.
Great. Thank you, Ellen. Almost no topic or technology inspires more confusion than chemical recycling, also called advanced recycling. The chemical industry has promoted it as one key tool in the toolbox to close the loop on plastic waste, while advocates and activists of many stripes are skeptical for different reasons. And almost everyone else doesn't seem to know exactly what chemical or advanced recycling even is. Last year, we predicted that NGO and funder skepticism would begin to boil over into efforts to disavow or cancel the technology. We got that right, although we didn't anticipate one key venue where these battles will play out in 2021, U.S. state legislatures. Pending bills in Maryland and Oregon could ban some or all forms of chemical recycling technologies. But in Oklahoma and Arizona, state legislatures have moved in the opposite direction, incentivizing it. And in Virginia, the so-called Great Polystyrene Compromise saw the technology reclassified with bipartisan support as a manufacturing process and not solid waste management to encourage it within the state. For most companies, navigating all of this is confusing. We predict it will continue to be so. The Maryland and Oregon bills banning chemical recycling may resurface for a vote this fall, and other states, eager to act on plastic waste, may follow suit. Even if not, we expect NGO advocates to begin to pressure brands and retailers directly to disavow the use of advanced recycling to meet their plastic waste goals. Unpacking this issue takes time, frankly, more than we have here. So if you're looking for guidance, I encourage you to reach out to me and the Future 500 team. We can help you start. And with that, I'll pass it to Andrea.
Thanks, Brendan. So the movement to electrify everything is certainly not new to most of you watching. The benefits of electrification and the falling cost of renewables are well understood by climate and energy experts. And this is part of why stakeholder groups we talk to have largely shunned the narrative behind natural gas as a bridge fuel. So while EVs have exposed the broader public to electrification principles, the issue with methane emissions as opposed to CO2 hasn't been as immediately understood. So advocates are now trying to tackle the upstream emissions challenge by targeting downstream demand for natural gas. So I'll come back to why I think this is important in a second, but first, just kind of looking at the indicators, more than 40 cities across the country have passed ordinances that either ban natural gas in new buildings or incentivize electrification in built infrastructure. Most of this is happening on the West Coast, but there's been a movement on the East Coast as well. However, there are a number of lawmakers who are skeptical of this approach. And so they've begun mobilizing to pass state legislation that would preempt local governments from banning natural gas hookups. And this is shaping up to be a very contentious battle. It obviously has implications for fossil fuels and utilities, but also for sectors that are grappling with their climate exposure, supply chain emissions, energy procurement. We see this on a global scale as well. So last year, Engie, a major French utility, they nixed a multi-billion-dollar deal with NextDecade to import US LNG because of their concerns about methane emissions in the West Texas Permian. So in terms of supply chain reverberations, tackling scope 3 emissions also really means tackling this methane issue. And since electrifying everything also raises important questions around both a just transition for workers and energy justice for low-income communities who are going to bear the brunt of this, both industry and advocacy groups will need to work together to address these impacts to ensure an equitable response. And one last thing to note before we move on is, while there are plenty of debates on how to lower emissions from the grid and different ways to get there, we're also seeing building stakeholder consensus that electrification could actually get the US anywhere from 70 to 90% of the way to net zero with existing technologies and little to no carbon capture. So depending on how bullish you are, that's a lot. And this argument that the US doesn't need as many new technologies or doesn't require a grand national sacrifice akin to changes in consumer behavior that are disruptive to get us most of the way there is sort of the most optimistic climate story that I feel like we've heard in a long time. It's the one that speaks most to ordinary people and intersects with their lives. So in some ways, I see this battle over building electrification as a proxy for messaging on decarbonization and climate as a whole. And that's why I think it's going to be really a good trend to watch over the next few years and just to get a sense of how it resonates with consumers. So with that, I think I'm going to pass it back to Kellen.
Great, thanks, Andrea. Look, I don't think I need to remind anyone here what a crazy year we all just experienced, with crisis on top of crisis, on top of pandemic, on top of wildfires, on top of murder hornets, on top of toilet paper shortages. So whatever the crisis that you were experiencing, I think what was probably clear to all was that these issues were manifesting most prominently at the local level. And as these crises become more frequent, become more damaging, and they become layering on top of one another, as I think this image so poignantly shows too, it is outstripping the resources of state and local governments. We're seeing this right now in the Western US as states and local economies deal with a historic drought while still trying to recover from the pandemic. So in response, what we're increasingly hearing from community advocates and broader stakeholder coalitions is, how are our biggest regional employers rising to the occasion to address these crises? How are they going to fill the gaps in the social safety net that are getting bigger and bigger? Now, early in the pandemic, we saw quite a few companies respond to this call to action in a fairly rapid way by writing bigger checks, making bigger donations on the local scale, helping to fill that void financially. But increasingly, this can't just be a philanthropic play for companies, at least in the eyes of stakeholders. What advocates, investors, and others want to see is more proactive investment in community resilience before the next crisis strikes. And they make a good case. How can companies expect to operate in a community that's crumbling? Will your employees come back to work if their home's been burned down in a wildfire? Will you be able to run your factory if there are rolling blackouts? A great case in point is from 2019, when PGE became the first company to suffer what was called a climate change bankruptcy after the tragic California wildfires that were sparked by their power lines. World Economic Forum described it as how resilience in action can destroy a business and cause immeasurable damage to the communities around it. So how can companies better support local communities while improving their own resilience at the same time? Stakeholders are calling for the following. First, act now. Don't forget the lessons learned over the past year, and let this post-COVID relaxation, return to normal be an excuse to kick the resilience can down the road or forget the lessons learned over the past year. Next, put your mouth where your money is. Don't just donate, but also engage with local lawmakers and advocate for policy changes that prioritize resiliency. Third, pay your share. Community investment is not going to win anyone over if your company is also taking advantage of loopholes that negatively impact the local tax base. We've seen a lot of commentary on this over the past month in particular for both companies and wealthy billionaires. And finally, when the next crisis hits, respond quickly and boldly and beyond just using your checkbooks. Hunkering down, laying off employees, or being the first in line for government bailouts might help you weather that storm, but it's going to have much more negative long-term consequences on your social license to operate. With that, I'm going to hand it off to Brendan again to talk about another prominent issue.
Yeah, thanks, Kellen. And another important issue. Our tagline for this trend last year was escalating political polarization is unraveling democracy. And unfortunately, 2021 only saw the issue of polarization get deeper. Frankly, this is a trend we wish we got wrong. Ahead of November's election last year, we saw a dual need and sets of internal and external expectations on companies to help, one, mend our partisan divides, and two, to stand up for free and fair elections and the right to vote in the United States. Even before the election, navigating this dual mandate was tense. Even the perception of election integrity itself was and is highly polarized, and standing up for voting deepened divides. Fast forward through the challenges to the presidential election, the storming of the Capitol, voter laws in Georgia and Texas, and many companies stepping up throughout these challenges. We see today that investor, civil society, employee, and consumer expectations for what is called corporate political responsibility are only growing. That term, corporate political responsibility, has the acronym CPR, and in many ways, that's exactly what American democracy needs right now. Companies are under the spotlight like never before for their giving to politicians, supportive of the insurrection, and their stance, and that of their associations, on voting rights as well as racial justice. The risks to companies in this charged environment are real, no matter what they do. Speaking up can invite political backlash, as we saw in Georgia, but inaction invites backlash as well. Talent, investors, and customers ask you and your company to be an agent of change. However, this moment can be one of opportunity, not just risk. While trust in all institutions is low, it remains relatively higher for companies. A stable democracy and society, and hence a stable marketplace, is in your best business interest. Imperfect as it may be, this is a moment that calls on corporate America to lead with integrity. Next slide. We know the challenges are difficult to navigate. In addition to our team, 3 resources we recommend are 1, the Herb Institute at the University of Michigan, 2, Business for America, and 3, In This Together. We hosted all 3 for a private briefing with our corporate affinity network just over a month ago. I'm going to drop here in the chat in just a moment links to all 3 of these organizations, and feel free to contact me directly for any introductions. And with that, Eric, I'll pass it off to you.
Great. Thanks, Brendan. Appreciate it. Next slide is there. Great. There's a kind of an alphabet to describe the pandemic economy, such as the P, there's the U and the W curves, but it's really the K-shaped recovery that's activated and mobilized funders, social justice advocates, and increasingly investors and shareholder advocates, which we anticipate will have implications for how corporate leaders set their priorities in the years ahead. The K-shaped recovery phenomenon, as many of you know, is one in which parts of the economy rebound at different rates. And the pandemic has laid bare the roots of income inequality and systemic racism across the globe. So this inequity and material impact was actually recently captured in a study by then global economist for Citigroup, Dana Peterson, who's now the chief economist for the conference board. Just last week, U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen announced that she believes the immense stimulus has enabled the U.S. to sidestep the K-shaped recovery by supporting the most impacted groups in our society. But racial justice advocates in their rapidly growing network of funders, as some of my colleagues have mentioned, are seeing it much, much differently than Secretary Yellen. Next slide, please. So these advocates and funders are viewing global efforts as insufficient. They see the pandemic as an opportunity to focus attention on economic inequality and to make equity a central feature of building back better and smarter. So what does this mean for you? Well, advocates and investors are going to be expecting companies to commit to reducing inequality and will be first, I think, honing in on corporate safety and labor practices, such as we're seeing recently related to Amazon's workplace and efforts to unionize. Second, we're going to see increasing scrutiny of corporate community relations around your fence lines, as we're seeing around industrial facilities, particularly in cities, which relates to some of Kellen's comments on community resilience. And third, we're also going to be seeing a growing focus on kind of higher level governance issues, that G and ESG, such as corporate tax avoidance, CEO to worker pay ratios, and stock buybacks. So the bottom line here is that how companies are going to leverage their business model to tackle economic inequality is quickly becoming a litmus test for stakeholder capitalism and corporate purpose in a post-pandemic world where the prospects for billions of people across the globe has worsened. Next slide. That concludes the formal presentation. We're going to now move into Q&A. As a reminder to our CAN members, we have our coffee hour tomorrow at 1 p.m. Pacific and 4 p.m. Eastern, during which we're going to dive more deeply into any of these issues or other challenges you are facing. Tomorrow's confab will be conducted under Chatham House rule, and we have 2 more guest passes available, so reach out if you're interested in joining. And for our guests today, we invite you or your colleagues to learn more about joining our CAN network. And for our partners, we have scheduled already some tailored executive briefings for some of you. So if any of others of you are interested in such a briefing, get in touch with me or others on the team. So with that, let's dive into the Q&A. A number of questions kind of been fielded throughout, which is great. So keep them coming. Here's one on biodiversity. So I'm queuing Ellen here. And you've touched on this, Ellen, so maybe you should just expand on it a bit more, but what's the potential for development of the biodiversity metrics that could provide equivalent information to GHG emissions intensity? I guess, where do you see kind of harmonization happening, and at what kind of pace and scale?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be quite interesting to watch the convergence of metrics develop, right? Because as we talked about earlier, we have 4 organizations that are simultaneously working toward developing either, guidance on targets, guidance on reporting, or kind of broad framework guidance. I think in terms of the question specifically around metrics and sort of making a comparison to GHG emissions intensity, that sends me down the path more of a science-based target. So I think the one to look for in that particular context is probably the Science-Based Target Network and the guidance that they'll be putting out. But I think all of them will be offering complementary guidance. And another element to this that I think is worth mentioning here is that all of these organizations have put together a statement of intent to work together. And so it remains to be seen a little bit how the convergence of some of these reporting frameworks, how that will happen and what that will look like for reporting going forward. For, I think probably anyone engaged in corporate reporting on the line has felt the overwhelm of the various reporting frameworks and disclosures and where do we look, and there are so many things that we need to report to, and this is yet another example of that happening in real time with this development. And so I think we don't quite have answers yet about how that will converge, but it's also something that I think bears looking at as we think about how these organizations work together and merge. I would expect that in the future, even if we end up with 4 frameworks right off the bat, at some point, I would anticipate a convergence down the line. But specifically for the question asker, I think starting with the Science-Based Targets Network would be a good place to go.
That's great. Thanks for expanding on that. That's very helpful for me. I guess next up, a question around integrated reporting came in, and so I'm going to kind of cold call on Andrea here, but will some form of kind of integrating reporting be mandated in the future? You kind of touched on this, I think, but maybe again expand. And if so, kind of which functional areas within companies should be leading on this, I think?
Yeah, that's a great question. So with integrated reporting, we're seeing a lot of, industries that have traditionally had to focus on reporting on climate risk, like oil and gas, be a little bit more advanced on the integrated reporting front. And most companies outside of those industries don't always use an integrated reporting framework because it's a little bit more burdensome or onerous. And they found that they've had more success sometimes communicating with investors by providing like a GRI index or a SASB or TCFD index to find information in their sustainability reports. I think as long as that information is very clearly presented at the end and it's very clearly, it's concise in those indices, then it's not always, necessary to do an integrated report. However, there's a very good chance that that's the way of the future. And that's one of the questions I think that the SEC was asking in their, public commentary and their request for public comments is, how do investors think that this information should be presented? And it's likely that for companies who have submitted comments, they probably are shying away from integrated reporting. They prefer a standalone sustainability report. So I think it really depends on developments and the discussions that happen over the next year or so with the SEC. But I think that is something that will be very important to keep an eye on and potentially be prepared for. But I think the bottom line with this question too is that if you are gathering this data for TCFD, for SASB, you will be very well prepared to make the transition to integrated reporting should you want to eventually do that in the future.
Great, thank you. There's a question that just came in from Hannah Leverson. What gives the appearance of a company jumping on the bandwagon versus authentically caring about the issue, e.g. the environment? We talked a lot about the real importance for companies to be authentic. So who on the team wants to respond to this? All right, I'll go call Kellen.
That's a great question. I think when you say a great answer, that's a great question. It's really a stalling tactic to give you more time to come up with the answer. So that's what I'm doing here. No, I think it boils down to a few things. We always talk about proactive stakeholder engagement, building relationships before you need them. I think that's a core part of it. If you are responding reactively to one of these trends, you can still build that trust with the stakeholder community and demonstrate that you are willing to be a leader, and you just have to act faster or at least do more if you're being reactive as opposed to a first mover. But it's harder to build trust reactively than it is to do it proactively. And so starting to engage on these issues before they become material or when you see them rising in your materiality assessment, I think is going to go a long way to avoid stakeholder skepticism. I think it also has to do with how transparent you're being about your commitments on it. We see a lot of companies who are really reticent to share anything about how they're working on an issue until it's perfectly polished, wrapped up with a nice bow, and then they can present it out there to stakeholders and say, hey, look at how great this is. But oftentimes, what stakeholders really want is to be able to look under the hood and to see how you're progressing along the way. They want to see humility as you're going, hey, we don't have all the answers yet, but we recognize that this is important. This is what we're trying to do to work on it. And we want to hear from you about it. When stakeholders don't hear until the end, that's when the skepticism happens, because they're saying, hey, how come we weren't involved in this process from the get-go? And how come you weren't communicating with us? We could have provided some feedback that would have kept you from going down these incorrect rabbit holes, for instance. So being proactive and being transparent, I think, are critical to ensuring that you don't appear as if you're jumping on the bandwagon.
That's great. That's great.
And just as a quick follow-on in terms of like the appearance part of it, just one quick way to demonstrate, I think, what Kellen is talking about. I got to preview a company's sustainability report this year, and they had just included a couple sentences about, we had all these calls with our investors this year, and here's a little bit of what we heard, and then here are some of the actions we took to address their concerns. And just that little bit of sharing their conversations and then also sharing the accountability piece of it really made me feel, okay, I know what you're doing, I know what you're about, and I see the process. I think that's a big part of it too, is not just understanding, what actions you're taking, but how did you get there and why are you doing what you're doing? And so I think looking for ways to convey that accountability feels very important.
And to act human, right? Nobody's perfect. It's all about relationships. We've seen a lot of companies do that, Ellen, where they even admit why they missed a target and give reasons why and how they're trying to kind of double down efforts to get better. So So here's a question from Edward Wong. And so he wrote that the trend to move from crisis response to community resilience is important and encouraging. And additionally, there's still the need to address the root causes of various crises, natural or man-made. So the reality is that all three need investments. So are there good resources that we're aware of on how best to balance the investment in all three areas that we can point Edward and others to? Who wants to answer?
Well, that one's probably targeted to me again, talking about community resilience. So I can take a crack at it, but would welcome commentary from the rest of the team. Edward, you're right that sometimes when talking about resilience, at least what I hear is, okay, well we're just accepting that climate change is an inevitability, and so we're just going to try to see how can we manage it. It's sort of the mitigation, adaptation, reduction type of dilemma. What I'm increasingly seeing, though, is that these companies and folks who are investing in resilience are trying to do that resilience in a way that also enables carbon reductions at the same time. So, some sort of coastal reforestation and restoration efforts oftentimes can also be a carbon sink in addition to improving resilience, like mangrove forests, things like that. I think there's also some coalitions that are building up that are trying to talk about these things in a really thoughtful way. One that I've come across in my research is called the City Business Climate Alliance. I'll drop the organization in the chat, but this is essentially trying to get cities and regional businesses on the same page around how can we increase our climate resilience while continuing to battle climate change at the same time. It's an initiative of CDP, WBCSD, and the C40 Cities Alliance. So I think there's some coalitions that are starting to think about that. And if any of my colleagues have any others to add, would welcome that as well.
Anybody else want to chime in? All right, we'll move on to the next question. This one came in from Brian Cooley. Hi, Brian. And I think this is most appropriate for Andrea. There's a proposal in the EU to expand the non-financial disclosure requirement of all companies doing business in Europe with, he thinks, more than 100 to 500 employees. Do you believe that this proposal will be enacted? And I guess to build on his question, can you talk a little bit about how maybe the EU is really the first mover on a lot of this these efforts, and where does global harmonization come in down the road?
Sure. So I'm glad this question came up because we wanted to sort of address this at some point during the trend, but we weren't sure if we would have time. So I think it's a really interesting one. I think it's the right question to be asking because the EU's regulation on sustainability-related disclosures in the financial services sector, that SFDR that Ellen described earlier. So that's a new obligation for ESG disclosures that's pretty likely to have significant effect, I think, for companies that are both domiciled in the EU, but also operate within the EU. And since the regulation, it's not actually really focused on investors themselves. It's focused on what they say, financial market participants. So the approach is actually designed to promote investors' ability to investigate companies' approach to ESG and then to act on the data and the information that's provided. So the European Commission has not clarified its position on whether this will apply to non-EU companies that operate in the EU or who market, funds into the EU, but there's widespread assumption that it will. And I think further, what's really interesting is that many large companies in Europe that are owned by parent companies in the US may be affected by a more limited, scope of this regulation. And internationally, companies that have EU-based investors are also likely to see a bunch of requests for their ESG data and information so that those investors will be able to comply with the regulation. And to get more specifically to Brian's question, as far as I understand, and I want to double check this, I think EU law mandates that any directive that is passed has to be transposed into national law by each member state. So that gives each country a certain amount of liberty to kind of decide how they want to implement the requirements that are set by the EU, as long as the directive itself is being honored. So countries themselves are mandated with interpreting and doing the best method of implementation. So it's not as straightforward as we like to think it is, but I think it is obviously a huge risk because the country in which your business is based will take decisions in terms of enforcement. And that's something that really needs to be considered a regulatory and reputational risk in terms of prosecution and penalties for non-compliance on this. So something I'll look into and provide some more information about, but I think it's really, really important. So I'm glad you asked it.
That's great. Thank you, Andrea. quickly to environmental justice related questions. This is an area we're doing a lot of work on right now. Is community relief part of EJ or environmental justice? And I guess, Kellen, I'll tee you up for this. What are the roles of kind of business, democracy, taxes, and funding to kind of pay for change in communities?
So two questions there. I'll start with the first one. Is community relief part of EJ? Yes, and EJ is part of community relief. I mean, I think anytime you're looking at the local level these days, environmental justice has to be a part of that, and recognizing the intersectional nature of these issues, that, environmental justice is racial justice. I think the environmental community in particular has historically sort of tried to separate these issues, and there's thankfully a bit of a reckoning happening now where all of these are becoming integrated. But when we think about community relief in particular, or moving to community resilience, there is a necessity of prioritizing those communities that have been historically marginalized and the most impacted by these disasters and broader environmental justice issues. I think we are starting to see some companies that are prioritizing this when thinking about community resilience. One that we mentioned in our report that I would encourage folks to look at, and I'll see if I can find a public link as well, but encourage you to check out the report. In January, Starbucks committed $100 million for a community resilience fund that was designed to advance racial equity and environmental resilience by investing in small business and community development projects in historically under-resourced BIPOC neighborhoods. So I think that's just one example of how companies are, when they're thinking about investing in their local communities, they're trying to factor in both the environmental justice component and broader resilience building as well. Would maybe want to punt to someone else around what are the roles of business, democracy, taxes, and funding to pay for change. I mean, I think the bottom line anyone would recognize now that, and kind of what I mentioned, that taxes and the tax base is clearly not up to the challenge at this point. And so what else is going to help pay for this stuff, especially in a time of so many political impasses as well. And I think a lot of stakeholders are going to be looking to the business community and saying, you want to be a part of this community, you're going to have to pitch into, because clearly we are deadlocked on the politics side of things.
Yeah, which relates to another question. Thank you, Kellen. Maybe it's more related to what you talked about, Brendan, is that companies suspended political giving to certain politicians after January 6th insurrection. So do you see companies kind of backtracking on those, and how are NGOs really keeping watch to and investors around political transparency?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say this is really something that's in process, and that it appears there are companies who are quietly backtracking on those commitments. There's increasing reporting how companies are sitting on a war chest of funds with respect to political giving, and it's remains to be seen how those will be deployed in 2022. There's also some good investigative reports on how money may be funneled to some of those politicians through intermediaries, such as lobbyists, to obscure that funding as well. I think what we're seeing at present is there are a few government accountability NGOs that are tracking this and publishing it. And it remains to be seen how widely that will be picked up and how widely companies will backtrack. It's an issue that we're watching closely, and so I anticipate that it'll be part of our trends report for next year, and that we'll have updates on this topic soon.
Great. Anybody else wanted to chime in on that at all?
Sure, just to sort of bounce back to another dimension of what Kellen was talking about and the environmental justice angle. And this, of course, backs in really well to what we were talking about with racial justice, and thinking about how, a lot of the kind of corporate trackers have noted, better progress on, companies willing to put forth and disclose some of those like internal metrics, and a lot less progress and a lot less willingness to disclose accountability on external actions. And so as companies start to think about, how are we supporting the communities in terms of resiliency in, in the communities in which we work, how does that tie into the racial justice statements they've been making and the actions that they want to be engaged in? So I think that's a really important piece of that conversation.
Awesome. There's another question from Edward. With the evolution of focus on ESG and reporting on it, what intersections do you see for the support for the UN SDGs? It seems that some companies are thinking about it, but there hasn't been really useful guidance on how one might do that. So, Kellen, Andrea,
I can take a crack at that one. Edward, you're crushing it with the questions today. And I think you're right. There haven't been a ton of useful guidelines. And I think part of that is still this dichotomy between the EU and the United States in terms of where the SDGs in particular have been really a focal point in terms of a framework for guiding broader corporate efforts on sustainable development. We've seen it a lot more in the EU than in the US. Oftentimes what we see is that US-based companies are having their broader ESG strategy or reporting, and then they will index it against the SDGs sort of after the fact, as opposed to using the SDGs as a guiding framework for their broader ESG strategy. That said, I think there is some interesting stuff coming out. And one area that I've been noticing is from B Lab, which is the organization that coordinates the B Corporation movement and a lot of complementary resources. And I'll put these links in the chat in just a moment, they have developed a tool for companies called the SDG Action Manager, which is the impact management solution, I'm reading now, for business action on the sustainable development goals. And that was developed by B Lab in partnership with GRI and UN Global Compact. And so they have really been mindful of that overlay between the SDGs and some of the more prominent global reporting frameworks. And so I think it's easier for companies to connect the dots by using this type of tool. Similarly, they have some blogs talking about how the SDG Action Manager can help with impact, how the B Lab B Impact Assessment, which is the assessment that companies can make to become a B Corp, but any company can do that assessment regardless of even if you want to become a B Corp, but how does that align with the SDG Action Manager? And then to add on top of that, B Lab also created a framework to compare GRI standard to the B Impact Assessment, and how the information that you use to report against one or to guide your strategy based on one can also inform the other. So you've got this sort of trifecta of GRI, B Lab Impact Assessment, and the SDG Action Manager that I think are all creating a more complementary framework around ESG and the SDGs.
Great. Andrea, did you want to add anything to the SDG comment or cue us for the poll, because we're right at the hour?
No, I think Kellen described it, very comprehensively. And again, in the EU, that the EU disclosure mandate was partially passed with reference to the UN SDGs. So they're being implemented a little bit more in the EU directives. But in the US, just like Kellen said, it's mostly around mapping how companies with their existing programs can reach some of the UN SDGs, but they're not being used to actually guide company strategies. And so that's something that's going to be, interesting, I think, for us to take a look at and see if that changes a little bit over the next few years. And then, we will queue up the poll. I'm almost done with it, so just give me one moment. And then I think we can, just wrap up, Eric, really quick.
Well, it's been fun to field all these questions. I appreciate everybody's peppering us with questions. Keep doing it in the coming days, and tomorrow on our Can Happy Hour, it'll be great to see some of you more on camera and at that session. Again, if some of the guests are interested in joining us, we have 2 more guest passes for that session tomorrow.
Okay, and Eric, I'm just going to put up the poll right now. All right. Okay, so now, what do you think? We wanted to get a sense of, after this discussion and presentation that we've done, what trends have you been noticing most closely in your work? This is multiple choice. You can answer, you can choose all of them if you'd like. And also just a reminder that these are anonymous. So feel free to not worry about being identified.
Since we can't vote, should we do round robin to hear what each of us thinks is the most important of our trends this year while we're waiting for the results to come in?
Obviously, all of the trends that I presented, clearly. I think we would all maybe.
All of your children are your favorites? Is that what you're saying, Andrea?
Exactly. I can't. How do you choose between E, S, and G, right?
Yes. I think we all would just choose the trend that we presented on, right?
We could do a round robin, but since we are at the top of the hour, I think we could probably close down the poll and just show the results.
Sure, go for it.
All right.
Wow, pretty evenly split.
Yeah. I mean, I think, Kellen, to respond to your question, I've just been more and more convinced that all of these trends are so interrelated that you really can't just pick one because they all intersect and impact each other so much.
I'm sure that's a great relief to all of our attendees on the line who know that they have to tackle all of these at once.
Yeah, no.
And that's why, that's why we can't be siloed, right? Talk to people in cross-functional teams, talk to cross-functional stakeholders. This is how we get an insight into these intersectional issues, because everybody has great expertise, but if we're all siloed, we need to be like talking to each other about this kind of stuff.
All right, that's a more positive note than what I was going to end on. So
That's great. Well, thank you to my colleagues. Again, excellent presentation. I feel great privilege to work with all of you. So thank you, everybody. And thank you to all of our attendees today. Again, we really appreciate your support of our work and engagement with us and engaging larger society on big ESG issues so we can help advance business as a force for good. Everybody have a great day.
thanks, y'all. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.